courtroom was already crowded long before the hearing even started. People sat in rows, whispering softly to each other while waiting for the judge to arrive. Some had come for their own cases. Some were simply there because they found courtrooms interesting. And others were there just to support friends or family. But that morning, a quiet tension filled the room, something different from ordinary days. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something unusual to happen without fully knowing what it would be. When the young attorney walked in, very few people even noticed him. He didn't make a dramatic entrance. He didn't walk in with a loud voice or a group of assistants behind him. Instead, he came in slowly, carrying a stack of neatly organized files in one hand and a simple notebook in the other. He looked calm, focused, and strangely peaceful for someone about to argue an important case. Some lawyers prefer to show confidence by speaking loudly or dressing in a flashy way. But this attorney was the opposite. His confidence came from quiet preparation, something that usually doesn't get attention at first glance. A couple of people sitting near the back whispered to each other, wondering if he was new or if he had ever handled a case like this before. No one seemed to know him well, and that made the room slightly more curious. Just a few minutes later, the judge entered. The entire courtroom stood up out of respect, and then everyone sat back down. The judge was known for being strict and sharp-tongued. He was someone who didn't accept mistakes easily. He didn't hesitate to make lawyers uncomfortable if he felt they were wasting time. Many attorneys who had appeared in front of him still remembered the pressure he put them under. When the judge's eyes fell on the young attorney, something shifted. It was as if the judge had already decided he didn't like him. Or maybe he simply thought the attorney looked too inexperienced for a serious hearing. The judge raised an eyebrow, almost as if he was expecting the attorney to stumble at the first question. The attorney remained polite, nodding slightly. He arranged his papers neatly on the table, checking that everything was in order. He didn't look nervous, but he also didn't look arrogant. He simply looked ready. Maybe that quiet readiness is what bothered the judge the most. The judge cleared his throat loudly. "Are you representing the client in this matter?" he asked in a tone that already sounded doubtful. "Yes, Your Honor," the attorney replied with calm respect. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the wooden bench. "This is a serious case," he said slowly, as if he wanted the attorney to feel the weight of every word. "I hope you're prepared and not here to waste the court's time." People in the courtroom exchanged looks. Some smiled quietly, already expecting things to go badly for the young attorney. The judge had intimidated many lawyers before, especially those who were new. For many, the pressure alone was enough to make them lose track of their arguments, stumble through their notes, or forget important facts. Everyone waited to see how this attorney would react, but he didn't flinch. He didn't look shaken or offended. Instead, he responded calmly, "I am fully prepared, Your Honor." Something about that answer seemed to irritate the judge. Maybe he wanted the attorney to appear unsure. Maybe he expected the attorney to sound small or scared. But the attorney's steady voice didn't match the judge's expectations. The judge shuffled through a few papers on his desk, pretending to examine them closely. "We'll see," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for people in the front rows to hear as the hearing began. The judge interrupted the attorney almost immediately. The attorney hadn't spoken more than 2 sentences before the judge cut him off. "You're going too fast," the judge said sharply. "Slow down. Speak clearly." The attorney nodded, though he had been speaking at a normal pace. He tried again, but the judge interrupted him once more. "Is that your argument?" the judge asked, raising his voice slightly. "Because if it is, you might want to rethink it before you embarrass yourself." There were small reactions across the courtroom, a few raised eyebrows, a few soft chuckles, and a few people shaking their heads. They had seen this happen before. The judge sometimes pushed too hard, hoping to shake a lawyer's confidence. The attorney took a small breath. He didn't argue. He didn't snap back. He simply adjusted his notes and continued, this time choosing his words carefully, making sure each point was clear. But again, the judge interrupted. This time he didn't hide his irritation. "You're avoiding the main issue," the judge said, leaning forward. "Your point is weak, and I hope you have something stronger than this." More whispers filled the courtroom. Some people looked at the attorney with sympathy. Others looked curious, wondering how long he could survive under this pressure. Yet, the attorney stayed composed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show anger or fear. Instead, he politely responded, "Your Honor, if I may continue? I believe the next point addresses exactly the issue you mentioned." The judge blinked, almost surprised by the steady answer. It wasn't the response he was expecting. Most attorneys would have stumbled by now. But this one didn't show any sign of breaking, as the attorney continued speaking. The judge repeatedly tried to throw him off. He questioned definitions, doubted the relevance of his documents, and even criticized the structure of his arguments. Each time, the attorney respectfully clarified the point and supported his statements with calm explanations. Some people in the courtroom started paying closer attention. At first, they thought the attorney was too inexperienced for the situation. But now, they noticed something different. Despite the judge's attempts to intimidate him, the attorney kept his voice steady. He never rushed, never trembled, and never lost his focus. The judge, on the other hand, was starting to look frustrated. He tried small tactics like asking the attorney to repeat things he had already explained, or requesting documents the attorney had already submitted. The attorney complied each time without complaint, which only made the judge's irritation more visible. Even the opposing attorney, who had been quietly amused earlier, now watched with growing interest. The young attorney wasn't breaking. If anything, he seemed more prepared than anyone expected. At one point, the judge sighed loudly and said, "Do you even understand the complexity of this case?" The attorney didn't show offense. He simply replied, "Yes, Your Honor, and I believe the court will find the facts clear once I finish presenting them." That answer shifted the room's energy. A few people sat up straighter. Some leaned forward, sensing that the attorney wasn't just holding his ground, he was setting up something important. The judge opened his mouth to interrupt again. This time, he stopped. Something about the attorney's quiet confidence made the judge hesitate for the first time that morning. The attorney continued explaining the case with calm precision. He used simple language, avoided unnecessary drama, and focused only on facts. His words didn't sound rehearsed or emotional, only sincere and well-prepared. And slowly, the room began to recognize that he wasn't just a young attorney trying his luck. He was someone who had studied every detail of the case, someone who had come not just to speak, but to stand firm. By the time he paused to take a breath, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted completely. People were no longer waiting for him to fall apart. They were waiting to see what he would do next. And the judge, despite all his early attempts to intimidate, now watched him with a different expression, one that showed he might have underestimated the attorney far too much. The more the attorney spoke, the more the judge's irritation seemed to grow. Even though the attorney was calm and respectful, the judge's tone kept getting heavier, sharper, almost as if he wanted to break the young man's confidence by force. The courtroom had already sensed the tension, but now it felt even thicker, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. The attorney continued presenting his points carefully, but he barely finished a sentence before the judge interrupted again. "That doesn't make sense," the judge said, shaking his head. "Explain it properly. I don't want to hear vague statements." The attorney had not been vague at all, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded and explained the point again, this time slower and simpler. People in the audience exchanged looks. They weren't sure if the judge was genuinely confused or just trying to break the attorney's focus. When the attorney finished repeating his point, the judge answered with another heavy sigh. No, he said sharply. "You're still missing the central issue. Do you not understand what you're arguing?" The courtroom felt the sting of that comment. A few people in the back raised their eyebrows. The opposing attorney smirked softly, thinking the young lawyer might finally lose his footing, but he didn't. Instead, the attorney flipped through his documents with patience and said in a steady voice, "Your Honor, I do understand the central issue, and the next part of my presentation directly addresses it." There was no shake in his voice, no frustration, no nervousness, just calm certainty. This seemed to annoy the judge even more, because he leaned back and crossed his arms, waiting with a cold expression. "Fine," the judge said. "Go on." but I hope this is better than what you've said so far." Most attorneys would have felt discouraged after hearing such words. But this attorney took a deep breath, straightened the files in front of him, and continued. His tone didn't change. He didn't sound scared or defensive. He sounded like someone who had prepared for weeks and wasn't going to let interruptions ruin his focus. He began explaining a specific section of the case, something that required attention to detail. At first, the judge only watched him silently. But as the explanation became clearer, more structured, and more solid, the judge started interrupting again, this time with questions, fast questions, sharp questions. What evidence supports that? And why didn't you mention this earlier? Are you sure you're interpreting the facts correctly? Each question was fired with the intention to shake him. The attorney didn't get defensive. He calmly answered every question, flipping to the right page, pointing to the right statement, or explaining the logic behind each point. He didn't rush. He didn't stutter. He didn't get irritated. In fact, the more the judge questioned him, the more the attorney's confidence quietly grew. It wasn't loud confidence. It wasn't the type that demanded attention. It was the kind that came from long nights of preparation, from going through the documents again and again, from understanding every detail until it became clear in his mind. Some people in the audience began whispering, "He's actually really prepared. The judge is pushing him way too hard. He's handling it better than most would." The opposing attorney looked more serious now. Earlier, he seemed relaxed, expecting an easy win. But as he watched the young attorney respond calmly to every interruption, he adjusted his glasses. Realizing this wasn't going to be as simple as he thought, the judge seemed determined to find a weakness. He asked for documents the attorney had already submitted. He questioned statements the attorney had already clarified. He repeated points that had already been addressed, as if trying to catch the attorney making a mistake. But the attorney stayed patient. He didn't show irritation. He didn't complain. He just continued explaining everything clearly, one step at a time. Then, the judge leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "Counsel," he said, "you're avoiding the real problem. This entire argument is weak. And frankly, I'm not impressed. Are you sure you even understand what your client is asking for?" The courtroom fell silent. This wasn't just a challenge, it was an attempt to make the attorney doubt himself. But the attorney didn't look shaken. He paused for a moment, letting the judge's words settle in the air. Then he looked up, meeting the judge's eyes respectfully. "Yes, Your Honor," he said softly but clearly. "I understand what my client is asking for. And I also understand the law supporting it. If you allow me to continue, the next part of my presentation explains exactly why this request is reasonable and supported by evidence." Something in the judge's expression twitched. Maybe he didn't expect such a steady answer. Maybe he was annoyed that his intimidation wasn't working. Or maybe he was slowly realizing that the attorney knew exactly what he was doing. The attorney continued again, this time turning to a part of the case that involved timelines and specific events. He laid them out in simple language, step by step, making sure that even someone new to legal terms could follow. The judge listened with a hard expression, but didn't interrupt for a few minutes. It was strange, almost like he was trying to find a flaw, but couldn't. Finally, the opposing attorney stood up. "Your Honor," he said confidently, "the counsel's argument is incomplete." He hasn't addressed the contradiction, and before he could finish, the young attorney calmly interrupted, not rudely, but firmly. "Your Honor, if I may respond to that," he said. The judge nodded. Giving him permission, the attorney then pointed to a section of the case file and explained how the supposed contradiction wasn't a contradiction at all. He used dates, documents, and statements to show a clear sequence of events. His explanation was so clear and logical that even the audience could follow it without trouble. When he finished, a quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. Some people looked impressed. Some nodded slightly. And some exchanged glances that said, "He actually knows what he's doing." The judge, however, did not seem pleased. Not because the attorney was wrong, but because the attorney had answered everything perfectly. The judge took a moment, tapping his pen against the bench. "Fine," he said, "but your interpretation is still questionable." The attorney didn't get defensive. He simply asked, "Would you like me to show the supporting ruling for this interpretation, Your Honor?" The judge hesitated. He didn't say yes or no. Instead, he waved his hand as if dismissing the question. "Just continue," he muttered. The attorney continued. The more he spoke, the stronger his arguments became. He used simple examples, clear analogies, and factual evidence. He didn't rush. His voice didn't shake. He didn't rely on dramatic language or emotional appeals. He didn't try to impress anyone. He simply explained everything with honesty and preparation. Slowly, the tone of the courtroom shifted. People were no longer watching the judge intimidate the attorney. They were watching the attorney stay focused under pressure. Something rare and impressive. Even the judge's staff exchanged subtle glances. Realizing the young attorney was not someone who could be easily rattled, finally, after almost an hour of back and forth, the judge attempted one last push. "Your argument is too simple," the judge said. "You're ignoring the complexity of the case. I don't think you're fully grasping its depth." The attorney closed his notebook gently. He looked up at the judge, his expression calm, almost peaceful, with respect. "Your Honor," he said softly, "I believe clarity is more helpful than unnecessary complexity. And everything I've presented so far is supported by evidence. If the court needs further explanation, I'm ready to provide it." The courtroom fell silent again. For the first time, the judge didn't respond immediately. Something had shifted. The judge's attempts to intimidate weren't working. And though he didn't show it openly, something in his expression suggested that he knew it. The young attorney had stood his ground, and the courtroom knew this was just the beginning. As the hearing continued, the atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted in a way no one expected. At the beginning of the session, most people thought the young attorney would fall apart under the judge's pressure. But now, after watching him stay steady through every interruption, every harsh comment, and every sharp question, the audience had begun to see him differently. He wasn't just a young lawyer anymore. He was someone who knew exactly what he was doing, someone who had come prepared for whatever challenge the judge threw at him. Still, the judge wasn't ready to back down. He sat high up on the bench, arms crossed, face stern, eyes narrowed as if searching for a single weak point in the attorney's argument. But no matter where he looked, he couldn't find one. The attorney's explanations were too clean, too organized, too well supported. The judge's tone grew sharper. "Counsel," he said, "your argument seems straightforward on the surface, but it lacks depth. You're acting as if this is a simple matter. It's not." The attorney didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a breath, glanced down at his notes, and then spoke in the same calm voice he had maintained since the beginning of the hearing. "Your Honor," I said, "sometimes the truth is simple. Sometimes the facts are clear when we look at them without adding unnecessary layers of confusion." A couple of people in the audience quietly smiled at that. Not because the attorney was being rude. He wasn't, but because they could see he wasn't afraid. He wasn't raising his voice or speaking out of turn. He was simply stating what he believed, firmly but respectfully. The judge didn't like the answer. His expression tightened. "So, you're saying the court is confused?" he asked, trying to twist the attorney's words. The room went silent. That question was sharp enough to make even experienced lawyers lose their balance. But the young attorney didn't flinch. "No, Your Honor," he said softly. "I'm saying the facts speak for themselves, and I trust the court to see them clearly once they're all presented." That response caught the judge off guard. He had expected the attorney to apologize or backtrack. Instead, the attorney stood firm while remaining respectful. It was a rare balance, one that many older lawyers struggled to maintain. The judge shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. He wasn't winning this battle the way he usually did. Instead of showing weakness, the attorney grew more steady with every question. Instead of becoming nervous, he became more focused. The opposing attorney could feel the shift too. Earlier, he had been relaxed, almost amused. Now, he adjusted his posture, straightened his files, and stopped smiling. This case was no longer predictable. The young attorney had surprised everyone. The judge interrupted again. "Explain this section," he said, pointing to a paragraph in the file. "Your interpretation seems incomplete." The attorney walked to the table, picked up the document, and returned to the podium. He didn't rush. He didn't look stressed. He simply flipped to the correct page and read the paragraph out loud then. In clear language, he explained why the paragraph supported his argument and how it connected to the earlier points. His explanation was so simple that even people in the audience who didn't understand legal terms could follow along. The judge leaned forward, scanning the document. It was as if he was hoping to find a flaw, but the more he read, the more he realized the attorney's explanation was correct. Still, the judge tried again. "That paragraph doesn't change the outcome," he said, voice tight. Respectfully, the attorney pointed to another section. "Your Honor, that's why the next clause is important. May I read it?" The judge hesitated. Then he gestured with his hand. "Go ahead." The attorney read it. The moment he finished, a quiet ripple moved through the courtroom. The clause directly supported the attorney's position clearly and strongly. Even people who didn't understand everything could tell something important had just happened. The opposing attorney looked uneasy. His face lost the confident expression he had earlier. He picked up his pen, tapping it nervously on the table. Even he hadn't expected the young attorney to be so thorough. The judge tried to remain firm. "Fine," he said. "But that still doesn't explain why you think your interpretation is stronger than the opposing side's." The attorney closed the document, placed it gently on the podium, and spoke with calm certainty. "Your Honor," he said, "because the opposing interpretation leaves gaps that the law doesn't support. If I may show the court the contradiction, I believe it will become clear." The judge raised one eyebrow, suspicious. "Very well," he said. "Show us." The young attorney walked the court through the opposing side's interpretation, step by step, pointing out the parts that didn't match the evidence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound dramatic. He didn't insult anyone. He simply used the facts. At one point, while explaining a key detail, a soft whisper spread through the courtroom. People were visibly impressed. The attorney's explanation was clear, logical, and impossible to ignore. The judge tried one more time to interrupt him. "Wait," the judge said sharply. "You're making assumptions." The attorney's reply was calm. "No. Your Honor, I'm using the evidence exactly as it's written." He flipped to another section and gently placed the document where the judge could see it. "This part here," the attorney said, "confirms what I'm saying." The judge scanned the text. His eyebrows tightened. The attorney was right again. By now, the courtroom had completely changed. Just an hour earlier, people expected the attorney to crumble. Now the same people leaned forward in their seats, watching him closely, almost rooting for him. There was something inspiring about the way he stood there with patience, clarity, and quiet confidence. He didn't need to raise his voice to make an impact. He didn't need to argue loudly to defend his point. He wasn't trying to win through ego. He was simply letting the truth speak through careful preparation. The judge felt the shift too, and instead of calming down, he tried to regain control. "Counsel," he said, "you still haven't addressed the relevance of your final argument." The attorney looked up, almost as if he had been expecting that question. "Your Honor," he said, "that was what I planned to explain next." The judge blinked. Just a small reaction, but people in the courtroom noticed it. The attorney wasn't just answering questions, he was staying 3 steps ahead of them. The attorney then moved to the final part of his argument. This was the part everyone was waiting for at the moment that could change the direction of the case entirely. He outlined the final point slowly, clearly, breaking it down into small pieces so that every listener could understand it. Each sentence connected perfectly with the previous one. Each explanation filled a gap. Each example reinforced his argument. And behind every point, there was evidence, strong, factual, detailed evidence. By the time he finished explaining the final point, something unexpected happened. The courtroom fell silent, completely silent. Even the judge didn't speak. His face froze in a way that revealed something he wasn't expecting to show: surprise. Not loud surprise. Not dramatic surprise. Just a quiet realization. The young attorney's argument was not weak. It was not incomplete. And it was not simple, dash-minded. It was solid, stronger than anyone in the room had expected. Stronger, even. Then the judge was ready to admit. The opposing attorney slowly sank back into his seat, eyes lowered, knowing the direction had changed. And the young attorney, he stood there quietly, waiting for the judge to respond. He didn't smile. He didn't show off. He simply waited, just as respectful and calm as he had been from the beginning. The judge tapped his pen slowly, thinking. It was clear he wasn't ready to admit defeat. But it was also clear he had been pushed into a corner he never expected. The plan to intimidate the attorney was falling apart, and everyone in the courtroom knew the real turning point was coming next. The next morning arrived with an unusual calmness in the courthouse. The long corridors, usually filled with hurried footsteps and quiet murmurs, felt strangely peaceful. But that peace didn't reflect what was happening inside the attorney's mind. He had spent half the night thinking about the judge's sudden change of behavior, replaying the moment when the courtroom went silent and everyone's eyes turned toward the bench. He wasn't proud that the judge had been embarrassed, but he also knew the truth had to come out. Still, he wondered how the final day of the hearing would unfold. A judge who felt exposed could act in unpredictable ways. He left his small apartment earlier than usual, hoping to reach the courtroom before the crowd filled the hall. But when he arrived, he found people already waiting, curious watchers. Local reporters, even a few law students who had heard whispers about the unusual tension in the courtroom. They weren't there for the case. They were there for the judge versus the young attorney's story that had spread around the building like wildfire. The attorney didn't pay attention to any of them. He walked in quietly, keeping his files close to his chest, and took a seat at his table, preparing himself mentally for whatever was coming. For a few minutes, the courtroom was calm. Then the doors at the back swung open. Everyone turned. The judge stepped inside with a slower walk than usual. His face looked tired, almost heavy, like someone who had spent the night thinking too much. People expected him to slam his gavel and start the session with the same commanding tone he always used. But he didn't. Instead, he sat down gently, adjusted his glasses, and took a long breath. The silence was thick, almost uncomfortable. It wasn't the silence of fear today, more like curiosity, mixed with suspense. The judge cleared his throat and spoke, in a softer voice than anyone had ever heard from him. This court will now resume. His tone was flat, but not aggressive. The attorney noticed it immediately. The judge was trying to keep everything controlled. Maybe he was trying to regain the respect he felt slipping away. Maybe he wanted to prove that he was still in charge. Or maybe he was simply tired of the conflict and wanted to finish the case without more damage. Whatever the reason, attorney decided that today he would stay calm no matter what. He didn't want to embarrass the judge again. He didn't want a victory built on someone else's downfall. He just wanted fairness. The hearing began with the other side presenting their final arguments. Their lawyer spoke quickly, trying to sound confident, but everyone could tell his voice was shaky. He kept glancing toward the judge, as if hoping for approval or support. But the judge's eyes stayed down on his notes the entire time. No nods, no reactions, nothing. Then it was the attorney's turn. He stood up slowly, took a breath, and walked toward the center of the courtroom. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to sound dramatic. He spoke in simple, clear words that even someone sitting in the very back could understand. He talked about the facts, the evidence, the mistakes the other side made. He didn't exaggerate anything. He didn't attack anyone. He simply told the story of the case as it was, piece by piece, letting the truth speak for itself. At first, people listened politely. Then they listened carefully. Then they listened with full attention, because there was something powerful about the way he explained things. He didn't act like he was trying to win. He sounded like someone trying to make things right. Halfway through his argument, the judge raised a hand slightly. The attorney paused, thinking the judge was about to interrupt again. But the judge didn't speak. Instead, he lowered his hand and gestured for him to continue. That small gesture said a lot. It said, "I hear you," for the attorney. That was more meaningful than any victory. When he finished, he walked back to his table quietly. His hands were steady, but inside he felt a strange mixture of fear, relief, and hope. He had done his part. Now the judge had to do his. The courtroom remained silent as the judge organized his notes. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. The air felt heavy again. But this time, it wasn't the heaviness of intimidation, it was the weight of anticipation. The judge finally looked up, and for the first time in the entire hearing, he looked directly at the attorney with steady eyes. "This court has reviewed all presented evidence," he said, "and after considering the facts, the arguments, and the law, I have reached a conclusion." His voice shook just a little on the last words. Everyone leaned forward. The judge cleared his throat again and continued, trying to keep his tone steady. "The defense has made a clear, compelling argument. The evidence supports their position. Therefore," he paused longer than necessary, "the court rules in their favor." The attorney felt something warm rise in his chest. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply bowed his head slightly, relieved that the truth had been acknowledged. But the moment didn't end there. After announcing the ruling, the judge unexpectedly continued speaking. "There is something I would like to add," he said, and the entire room stiffened. The judge looked around slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd. Then settling once more on the attorney, "This courtroom is meant to be a place of fairness and respect. And sometimes even those in positions of authority must remind themselves of that." People looked at one another. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. The judge continued, his voice now noticeably softer. "I may have acted in a way that didn't reflect the responsibility of this seat, and I acknowledge that. It wasn't a full apology, but for someone with his pride, it was a big step, a rare one, a shocking one." The attorney didn't expect it. He felt his breath catch for a moment. He simply nodded respectfully, showing the judge that he understood, and that he wasn't holding on to any resentment. The judge then added something else no one expected. To the young attorney, said, "You presented your case with professionalism and clarity. Continue on this path." The courtroom had been silent before. It was absolutely still now. People couldn't believe their ears. A judge who had tried to intimidate a lawyer, now praising him. Nobody would have predicted this ending. The judge dismissed the court, and everyone stood up. The attorney gathered his papers quietly. He didn't rush out. He didn't make eye contact with the reporters waiting outside. He moved slowly, letting the moment settle inside him as he reached the door. He heard a voice behind him. "You handled yourself well." The attorney turned. It was the judge, standing just a few steps away. His expression tired but sincere. "I wasn't fair to you earlier," the judge said quietly so only he could hear. "But you didn't let that stop you." "Thank you, Your Honor," the attorney replied gently. "I respect the court. That's all." The judge nodded, almost with relief, and walked away. When the attorney finally stepped outside, sunlight hit his face. Reporters rushed toward him, microphones raised, cameras flashing. But he didn't say much. He didn't brag or talk about the judge's mistake. He simply said the case was about truth, and that truth had spoken for itself. Later that evening, when he sat alone in his apartment, he thought back to the beginning of the hearing, the doubt, the pressure, the way people looked at him like he was too young, too inexperienced, too small to stand up to a judge. And he thought about the ending, the silence, the respect, the judge's unexpected words. He realized something powerful. It wasn't just a case that he had won. He had won respect, not because he fought aggressively, not because he humiliated anyone, but because he held on to patience, honesty, and calmness, even when the situation felt unfair. He learned that sometimes the strongest voice in a room is the one that stays steady. Sometimes the greatest victory comes without noise, and sometimes the person people underestimate the most ends up changing the entire atmosphere simply by standing firm in the truth. When he closed his eyes that night, the stress faded, replaced by a quiet pride, not loud, not showy, just a warm feeling of doing right. The next morning, the courthouse went back to its regular pace, with new cases and new faces. But people who had been there that day remembered what happened. They remembered how the young attorney stayed calm, how the judge changed, How the truth won without anger, and slowly. Word spread whenever someone underestimated that attorney. Someone else whispered, "Don't take him lightly. He might surprise you." The judge learned a lesson to one he probably wouldn't forget. And even though no one said it out loud, everyone knew the same thing. Respect is not something you demand. Respect is something you earn. And that day, in a quiet but unforgettable way, the young attorney earned it.